Niigaanwewidam James. Pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share with you space here and to be with people that I have such respect for, that work for the Indigenous Cultural Center, and the great work that you do, from Sharisa and Anna and Donis and my sister Danielle, Noah, Gabby, everyone who's at the Indigenous Cultural Center, everybody that does the work, and of course my friend from high school, Linda, who works there now. So really great to see everybody, and I'm really happy as well to be a part of this speaker series. I'm sorry to start a minute later, I couldn't find the link, and so I'm the reason that we're starting a few minutes late. So apologies to anyone who was waiting. A huge greeting as well to those of us from Selkirk, and I know there's a handful of people who are watching today about our home and about our territory. And this is a history that is hard to talk about, because it really talks a lot about who we are as people from that community, from the town of Selkirk, from the former site of St. Peter's, the current, of course, site of Peguis First Nation, but you won't find it on any map anywhere, because in 1907, the government of Canada with the town of Selkirk, the province of Manitoba, all conspired to have us removed. And because we have to call it for what it is. We have to we're going to talk a little bit about treaty today, of what was the intention of that agreement for us to be living in that territory. But throughout the world, when a racialized group of people are forced off the land, when there's a group of individuals who are targeted, who are told they are not good enough, that they don't deserving enough to have their claims recognized, that they are then forcibly removed by gunpoint from a territory. Throughout the entire world, we would call that ethnic cleansing. But in Manitoba, they call it progress, to remove us off the land and to force us to what's now Peguis First Nation in the Interlake. And that's a very somber way to start out this talk, but it's taken me my entire life to understand that that's what I've lived in. And I tell people, I call all of us in Selkirk, we are refugees. We are refugees that have experienced one of the most violent acts in Manitoba history. And we are people who are in the wake of that. We are people who are some of the most resilient and strongest in this province, in this country, in this Anishinaabe nation, Cree nation that we share with. We are people who are living in the echoes of such a profound moment of violence that it's remarkable that we are who we are. It's really remarkable that things that have happened in Selkirk that are not happening anywhere else. And so I'm going to get to that at the end of the presentation, but there are things that are happening in Selkirk that we will see nowhere else, anywhere on Turtle Island. And I think this is remarkable because it sets the groundwork for what we can see happening today in 2021 in Manitoba, which is really ground zero of reconciliation. There's no place that's happening that has the things that happen. More Indigenous peoples entering into mainstream businesses, more Indigenous peoples entering into leadership positions throughout all sectors of society, more Indigenous businesses, more the heart of the Métis Nation. There's a reason why this community that I come from, while I'm biased, it is the birthplace of everything you see today. It is the place in which you see some of the most innovation. It is some of the most creativity, but at the same time, also the echoes of some of the most deepest violence in this country's history. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But to understand it, you really have to understand the history of where Selkirk comes from. The Peguis-Selkirk Treaty of 1817 comes from. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're going to also talk a little bit about what was the principle of the treaty, right? So let me just make sure I can share. There we go. Perfect. All right. So here we go. Yeah, so I'll just skip past these ones. These, you know who I am, you know stuff that I do, and you know this kind of stuff right here. Now, Whenever we start on any presentation, of course, we talk about tobacco, right? And the opening words always involve a sema. Now, I'm not here to teach you specifically about a sema today, but we know that tobacco represents time. Tobacco represents the time that you are offering to a space, and tobacco, because of the way that it requires, or the diligence that it requires when you grow it, the teaching of tobacco involves care, concern, compassion, being careful, being respectful of yourself. But most importantly is when you offer that tobacco, you're offering everything that it took for you to make that tobacco, to be here, Niigaanwewidam James, to be in this space. So the hundreds of hours that it took for you to grow that tobacco, to foster it, to be able to nurture it from this to this, is where that instancy, where that word asema, which refers to the word ashema, instant, Harry Bone likes to talk about that. That instancy that you offer that tobacco and someone must choose to pick it up, they must choose to accept it, then builds a relationship of commitment, of reciprocity. What you hope is that the gift that you offered of 100 hours will be returned with another gift of 100 hours. Until then, you return this gift ongoing and ongoing, because you don't just shake hands the first time that you meet someone, when you're on a pandemic anyways. You don't just trade names or food or time when you meet somebody. You're always renewing that all the time. So till the next time that you offer tobacco to one another and the relationship is renewed, that's what a treaty is. A treaty is about constant senses of renewal. Like when I offer you something, there's an expectation. You then accept that expectation, whether you understand it or not. Or you understand what's about to happen or not, but you know that you're going to offer the time necessary to build that relationship, and then it's renewed every single time you come together again. Now, regardless of whether white people understood that principle of what I just explained, that when you offer tobacco, you're expected to give a gift back, there are basic principles throughout all of humanity that gifts are always comes with strings. There's no such thing as a gift without strings. I don't care what culture you come from, Ukraine, Rwanda, Asia, I don't care where you come from in the world. Every gift comes with strings, meaning that there's no such thing as gift without expectation. And what's the expectation? Usually a thank you, or usually you're going to be my friend, or you're going to respect that I gave you something, whatever it might be. And so it is clear that regardless of whether white people understood what is the expectation of tobacco, which is a whole bunch of other things that we associate with it, medicines of the earth, the land itself, our relationship with the land, all of those things that go into growing tobacco. I don't really care if non-native people understood that or not. The basic principle of tobacco is that it took time for me to make this. I'm offering it to you. Therefore, I expect you to do something in return. I expect you to put some sort of time into this relationship. And that, my friends, is the entire principle of how relationships operate. Like, I don't care which nation you come from, what place in the world you come from. There's an expectation that when we offer gifts to one another, we're going to build a relationship. Like, nobody gives a gift without an expectation of some kind of relationship, even gifts that are negative. Like if somebody hurts somebody else, or offers somebody that they think is a terrible thing, or that it is a terrible thing, and that is another way of thinking about gifts. Because then there's also something expected to come back as well. It might be something in terms of an abusive relationship that I expect you to act abusively, or the way that whatever it might be, that these gifts always come with expectations. So therefore, this is what we do as Indigenous peoples. This is how we build our nations, is that we offer gifts to one another. And that's why you can look, if you look at the ways in which Indigenous Nations, it's a really great website, by the way, it's called nativeland.ca, and you can all check it out. But one thing I really love about this website is you can divide things up according to Indigenous nations, territories, languages, or treaties. Now, if you hit territories, which is what I've done here for you, and then you took a picture of this map, the two things that you're going to really notice that's very important is that there's a lot of Indigenous nations, first off, and then second is they all overlap. Like, how can you have nations that overlap? And you're asking yourself, well, that sounds like I want you just to imagine for a moment, what would it be like if the United States and Canada overlapped? Like, what would that look like? Do you think that the United States and Canada could share a territory and share the jurisdiction over that territory and share the amount of time necessary it would take to build a relationship of 50-50 sharing. Like, imagine what that would look like. Like, it makes no sense, right? It would never work. Like, or imagine this, what the Cree and the Anishinaabe would constantly do every single season in the Interlake of Manitoba is they would come together. They would say, or in and around Gimli, there would be lodges, also at Nestawea or the Forks. They would come together and they'd make an agreement. They'd be like, okay, all right, everybody, where are we going to put the border this year? And then the Cree would be like, well, we had some more babies. And the Anishinaabe would be like, well, we had some sickness, so, we lost a few people. So I'll tell you what, we're going to put the border between our two nations. We're going to put it at the shoreline instead of the tree line. And we're going to come together and do some ceremonies once in a while. A lot of us are intermarried, so we're going to share some lodges during the winter time. But generally, there's the Cree Nation over there, the Anishinaabe over there, and then we've got this kind of buffer zone place where we move the border every couple of years. I want you just to imagine what that would be like if Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever is U.S. president this week phones up Justin Trudeau and says, okay, where are we going to put the border this year? Like, I want you just to imagine what that would look like. Well, probably Canada would end up in like Baffin Island somewhere, because the United States would just keep taking and taking and taking. And frankly, if the United States was weak, Canada would just keep taking and taking and taking. Like, that's the way nation states operate. That's not the way Indigenous nations operate. And the reason why this is important is because it's tobacco. Because of tobacco. Tobacco is about understanding that this is where we come from. This is the gifts that we bring together. And while tobacco is just a symbol, it can also be food or a handshake or names. This is where we come from. This is why when we introduce ourselves, we talk about the territory we come from, talk about the people we come from, talk about all the different things that we bring to the space. We say, Niigaanwewidam James, and then we offer that gift, because that gift is about going, okay, we're going to share the space. And that's what treaty is. Treaty is about sharing and understanding with one another in a space and a time for a set period. So in tobacco, it's till the tobacco time is run out. Then we will renew that relationship. We'll renew the obligations and responsibilities to one another. And every year we'll move the border. We'll move it up the shoreline or the tree line, depending on what we need. And then remarkably, Indigenous Nations integrity maintained in themselves was it was intact. Like, there is such a thing as called the Anishinaabe Nation. There is such a thing called the Cree Nation. They're humongous nations, right? Humongous nations, the Anishinaabe ASCII. But yet somehow, regardless of the fact that we shared territories and jurisdictions with people, the integrity of our nations remained intact. Now, this is really crucial to understand, because this is about how space is shared, how people live together, how they share resources, and probably most important of all, how we live with our non-human relatives, who are, frankly, way more important than we are when it comes to treaty. Because you and I can get along together as much as we want, but if we got nothing to drink, there's no point. Like, our agreement is a big bunch of hot air. It's a big waste of time. If we don't have a safe territory to live, meaning that there's no pollution or we can live off the earth, then frankly, the treaty is a big null and void. Like, there's no point to it. It's why the treaty principles, any treaty must always consider the earth, which again explains why tobacco is so important. Now, the reason why I tell you this is because, we can talk about treaty, and I know this series is talking a lot about treaty, but the basic principle of treaties are what I explained to you, or what we call the spirit and the intent. The spirit and the intent is always about sharing and expectations, and what is it that we're going to agree to going forward into the future. And one of my favorite phrases that I borrow now from former Treaty Commissioner Jamie Wilson is that no treaty has ever been about the past. There is no treaty that's ever been negotiated that says, okay, we're going to talk about all the things that have happened to bring us to this place, or our claims, or like the land claims that we have. That's where the Supreme Court of Canada, and frankly any legal mechanism in Canada, gets treaties absolutely 100% wrong, in that they say that, oh, it's your job to come to the court and argue where your treaty historical use and occupancy is. In fact, I've been an expert witness in trials for Peguis First Nation, also for the Southern Chiefs. And the number one question that people always ask is, where is your treaty claim? Where is your historical use and occupancy of that land? That's not what treaties are about. Treaties are about going, okay, We agree that we're going to share this space. Here's the parameters. We can even draw it according to the river. We can call it according to this land, whatever it might be, our shared space. But yet it's about tomorrow. How are we going to share that space tomorrow? It's not about going, okay, you prove to me that you're legitimate in this space. By the fact that the treaty has been made, that legitimacy has already been approved, has been acknowledged, has been recognized. So we don't need to keep asserting ourselves in relation to the Canadian state of going, this is where our treaty area is. It's already been legally affirmed. Now, of course, Canada doesn't recognize that. And we have to keep doing this cartwheel in the Supreme Court by playing according to games and rules that are not our own. And fundamentally, it's like trying to argue under someone else's rules. Guess who's always going to win? If someone else gets to set the parameters of the rules in which we have to negotiate and talk about who we are as treaty people, then surprise, surprise, Canada always wins, like all the time. Now, granted, recently the Supreme Court has started to move slightly, Delgamau and so on, but that's the challenge here, is that when we talk about treaties, we really have to talk about fundamentally our relationship with the earth and the agreement that we've made with the earth, because treaties did not begin with white people. Treaties began with our relationship and our sacred relationship to our creation stories. In our creation stories, they are the fundamental truths of treaties, of who we are. So there's many translations, for example, within the word Anishinaabe, but one of the many translations is the people that were set down, right? And so that's part of our creation story. That's talking about when we were set down, created from the elements of the earth, that then we were placed, and this great meeting was held. And the great meeting that was held was with all of the animals, the beings of creation. And in our creation story, it said that there was a discussion and an agreement that was made, was that the animals, the fish, the birds would agree to take us into their territories and adopt us. And our agreement to that, because gifts are always coming with strings, is that we must take their names, we must take their identities, we must take their relationships with the earth and then adapt them to our own. Because frankly, we are so fragile, we are so helpless, we are so fleshy that we could not live without our animal and our fish and our bird relations. And that's where the clan system comes from. The clan system is the birth of the original treaty. And the original treaty was that we would share those spaces with our clan relatives who would care for us, show us the medicines, show us the earth, show us who we could be. And that's where our first treaty exists as human beings. Now, of course, this is not to deny that there were treaties before humans. There were treaties between the sun and the moon to share space. There was treaties between sound and motion. Like there was all these other treaties that exist within Anishinaabe cosmology. I'm not here to talk about all that stuff for today, but I talk about it in my book that will probably never come out. But the very first treaty for humans is that clan relationship, is talking a little bit. And you may be wondering, like, what the heck does this have to do with the Selkirk Treaty? You're going to see in just a minute that all this is going to come together. Now, of course, Canada is not interested in hearing about any of these things because Canada is too busy occupying an interesting, trying to, expand empire. The Royal Proclamation is the epitome of empire. I could talk about the Popple Bulls. I could talk about the 7 Years' War and the French-British War, which ends up in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I can even talk about the American Revolution if I wanted to, a War of 1812, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. I can talk about all those things, but really the linchpin of talking about what Canada has done has been, and then resulted in the removal of Selkirk in 1907, but the creation of the Selkirk Treaty when they come together in 1817, is the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation is basically when the King George III said, everything is mine. And he announced that it all would be his, which does two really important things in North America. A, it recognizes Indigenous title according to the terms of the King, meaning it says we have a sense of ownership, meaning that we own the land. We don't have that sense of ownership. That's not who we fundamentally are. We have relationship with the land, right? That goes back to the treaty, the tobacco conversation that I was talking about just a minute ago. But in 1763, the King said, you have title, meaning he didn't quite say it like that, but he said, you can have the lands until I get there, and then I will purchase it from you, and I'm the only one allowed to purchase it from you at a price of my own choosing. So it's really just a nonsensical, stupid thing that the king did, but that's the terms that the king had recognized. So unfortunately, that's what we're left with in Canadian law, is only ownership. That's the only conversation that we can have until very recently with decisions like the Delgamuau decision. But 1763, the king says everything is mine. The second thing that it does, which is just for those of you that are history buffs, this creates the American Revolution, because it stops Americans from being able to buy Indian land. And the Americans, of course, create a revolution over it. And they also don't like to be taxed very much, the Americans, because they like to build the state. Watch Hamilton if you want to know what I mean. But the bottom line of it is that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 takes what was existing relationships between, or potential existing relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and puts it into one conversation only: ownership. Now, this is really crucial for you to understand, because any kind of hope of Indigenous peoples offering to non-Indigenous peoples something outside of that parameter, something outside of ownership, then is almost null. It's almost impossible to have that conversation, because how do you talk about relationship when you talk about ownership? Meaning that I only own you, or I own the land, or I only own the things that we can create the borders. That's where we get into that Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, Donald Trump discussion of, well, no, my only job is to control the space that I have ownership over. It's not about relationship anymore, of sharing tobacco or renewing tobacco. The Royal Proclamation is the most devastating document in North American history when it comes to for us to understand what are the Indigenous visions of what Turtle Island looks like. Because then it forms the basis, or begins a path, that path in which the king has dominion. All of the different lands up until the Rocky Mountains are under the purview of the king. They're going to claim ongoing the abilities. They're going to create reserves off to the side once they purchase the land. And it also stops anyone else from having any else relationship. And so without getting too heavy into the Royal Proclamation, you can just list this various different problems that have happened as a result of the Royal Proclamation. There's no consultation. There's this weirdness around Indian title is only in terms of ownership. It's not in terms of relationship. So then we're stuck with this endless marches to the Supreme Court trying to argue who we fundamentally are. There's this weird sense of what a nation is. Now suddenly Indigenous nations have to be in the ways in which British nations operate, or particularly European nations, which are nation states, which are not, like, Indigenous nations are not nation states. They are different. They're like collaborative. The better way to think of Indigenous nations is probably the closest thing in the European mind would be like the European Union. Everybody sharing a space and agreeing to live together. You may have some separate territory, but generally you have interaction. You share things like resources, or in the case of the European Union, like currency. But you can see how dysfunctional that is. Our nations were certainly a lot more, not that they were perfect, but they were a lot more functional, because the clan system would work out that kind of ways in which they would interact. Now, I don't want to do too much of that, but I just want to, before I jump off the Royal Proclamation, which really sets the groundwork, we have to really talk about the Treaty of Niagara, because it's not that Indigenous nations accepted this passively. Indigenous nations always reacted and also resisted, but also creatively interacted with different senses of what the British were bringing to North America. And so the Treaty of Niagara is a good example of that, to be able to understand what that looks like, because not only do we see Indigenous nations interacting with notions of treaty, even on the groundwork of the British, right? So the Treaty of Niagara is with Sir William Johnson at Niagara Falls. 24 nations agreed to the Wampum Belt, which is the Covenant Chain, and the 24 Nations Belt. If you want to see what those look like, they look like here. That's Alan Corbier, by the way, in the picture that I just showed a second ago. Notice how the principles of tobacco are still present. In the Gashwantha, for example, right? The treaty right here, which is the Two-Row Wampum. They're still going to share the water. The story of this treaty is that two canoes will travel in the water. Never the two shall meet, but always the two shall share the water together. So what that means is private space can exist within that, but that the two will always share that space. So notice how that's Indigenous creativity. That's talking about private space and public space. Or in the way that I can explain it best through like a roommate analogy, is we're going to live together, but we have 2 separate bedrooms, but we're going to share the living room, the bathroom, the kitchen. That means we have to share responsibilities with one another. So embedded within that notion of treaty is that constant sense of responsibility with one another. Now, boom. Here we are in 1817. We're in the shadow of the 1763 Royal Proclamation. The king has said, everything is mine. Indigenous peoples, however, since time immemorial, have senses of relationship, which they've been then offering to Europeans through things like the Gashwantha, but also the 24 Nations Belt of 1764 and so on, saying to Europeans, no, it's about sharing space. Europeans, meanwhile, are about like, no, this is about ownership. It's about me purchasing the land and then moving you onto a reserve. So we've got 2 different paths of viewing relationships, and boom, things arrive in Manitoba in 1817. Now, before I really begin this, I just want to tell you 2 things. There are no non-native people in Manitoba until 1783 in terms of a permanency. There are a few French fur traders and so on. The Northwest Company has begun, but there are no real non-Indigenous presence in downtown, what we now know as Winnipeg, until 1783 when there's a smallpox epidemic. A smallpox epidemic which begins in Hudson Bay, comes with the Hudson Bay Company, filters down through Indigenous Nations, arrives in Winnipeg in 1783, obliterates the community which is known as Nestawea, which is 3 points. And there's a community there of mostly Assiniboine or Lakota, Nakota, Dakota peoples and Cree peoples who are in the downtown core of Winnipeg. It's a community of about 6,000 people. And those 6,000 people who live there, most of it permanently, rely predominantly on the bison. They rely on trade. They are intermarried for the most part. But because of that smallpox epidemic, the Assiniboine people, the Nakota, Lakota, Dakota people retreat to Brandon. The Cree people stay for the most part, but move up the river to what's now known as Netley Creek or Niigaanwewidam, which is the traditional name of that place, which is Death River. And that's referring to that 1783 smallpox epidemic. And that's the place in which Peguis arrives. Peguis had been traveling up here with other people at Sault Ste. Marie, Anishinaabe people, for many years before that. It'd been a traditional territory to hunt and to fish amongst the Great Lakes, to come in and as far as Nestawea, but had never settled permanently until the people of Niigaanwewidam, Netley Creek, asked Peguis to stay and build a community in 1783. In 1817, there was a conversation after settlers, Selkirk particularly, began to arrive in about 1805, 1807. And here's the story of that interaction right here. I've got 2 videos I'm going to show quickly. This one first starts in 325 right here. It talks a little bit about this video is coming from the historical land claim of where Peguis First Nation is arguing about the homeland of Selkirk. But this video is really useful because it talks to you about how Peguis arrived and then what happened in the settlement in that area. And then these videos will overlap slightly, but the next one is a real big propaganda video, so we're going to have to put our critical hats for the next one. But this one's a good one. This one's produced by Peguis First Nation.
The land to the immediate north of the city of Selkirk was settled by the ancestors of the Peguis First Nation long before the arrival of immigrants from Europe. Chief Peguis had recognized authority to issue deeds or grants of land rights in the area, which were transferred among the First Nations and other residents of the settlement. As a result, by the time of Manitoba's admission into the Canadian Federation in 1870, there were many non-Indians, including Métis persons, in possession of land within the settlement.
Under the Proclamation of 1763, any land matters dealing with First Nation had to be done through the federal government. We see the Manitoba Act of 1870 as being premature. What that did is it gave homestead title, I guess, to the newcomers. So it kind of pushed our entitlement aside, and they agreed to deal with the newcomers at our expense.
Prior to signing the treaty on August 3rd, 1871, certain assurances were given to the members of the First Nation.
People of St. Peter's were entitled to hold land under the Manitoba Act as private land holdings, and there was confusion there with regards to whether or not that land would be included as reserve land. At the signing of the treaty, our people were assured that that land wasn't going to formulate part of the treaty land entitlement, but it would be included as reserve also. Chiefs and headmen at the time questioned the treaty commissioners from the government of Canada and asked them if land would be made available for their grandchildren's children in the future. And there is oral assurances that the commissioner did see that there would be land requirements in the future based on a growing population of First Nation communities. And this oral assurance is recorded in the newspaper of the time from the Manitoban, and also in addition from the oral histories of our elders.
The survey of St. Peter's Indian Reserve 1 was completed in 1874.
Okay, so I like to stop at this map right here because in 1807, what happens is Peguis and Selkirk begin to have a conversation. And Peguis, of course, had settled in Niigaanwewidam, had grown that community. In fact, it was known as a great orator, a great storyteller, and was able to gain leadership along the Red River amongst the other nations, some of them Lakota, Dakota as well, mostly Cree, however. And those different nations which recognized that Peguis not was a supreme spokesperson, but was in many ways a good relationship builder with non-Indigenous people, had been tasked with the agreement, or to build an agreement with the burgeoning Selkirk settlement, which Selkirk at the time was a Scottish leader who came to Manitoba bringing the hopes and the dreams of the Hudson Bay Company. And I want to show you this brief video talking a little bit about Selkirk so you can know a little bit about Selkirk. But you have to know that this is a video that's produced by kind of a rural Manitoba perspective. It's full of like the triumphant settlers and so on. So just take this video with the propaganda kind of that it is. But I like it because it gives you some facts on who are Selkirk and how did they come? What were they seeking? And then we'll talk a little bit about how the Selkirk Treaty and the Royal Proclamation come together. All right, here we go.
Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, became the unexpected support for displaced families who were evicted from their homes in Scotland. Through his determination and their courage, they moved west to Manitoba, seeking refuge on the prairie.
Thomas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, was an idealist and a philanthropist, and he inherited vast sums of money because all of his brothers died young, and as a result he had a very large fortune, and he used that fortune to charter ships to take struggling Highlanders from Sutherland to Red River Settlement, which turned out to be the beginning of Winnipeg.
The landowners found it far more profitable to turn the land to sheep farming than the original small farming tenants that they had had there before that. The improvement policy was fourfold. They were encouraging wealthy sheep farmers from the south to come up to these vast areas of land where they could set their sheep out in these large sheep walks. There wasn't enough room on this land for the sheep and the people.
Cook actually visited North America around about 1803, 1804, and he got to know some of the people who ran the Northwest Company, particularly people like Alexander Mackenzie, who of course had
so he traveled there
across the continent.
And then
in a place they'd never even seen before, but they knew that there was land there, and there was land that they could have if they worked hard, and they could continue working in the same way they wanted to. They would be farmers. So it was an incentive for them to go.
Thomas Selkirk didn't revisit as often as he would have wished because...
Okay, so two things about the Selkirk settlers is when they show up, they're seeking a place in which they can create agriculture. And second is they need to have land plots based with sheep farming particularly. What does that mean? They need to be close to water. Now, Peguis and Selkirk, one reason or another, built a relationship, and that relationship was different than what had been created with the Northwest Company. The Northwest Company had built a relationship with many people along the Red River, but that there was a burgeoning Métis settlement as a result of that was connected with the Northwest Company. With the Hudson Bay Company, the Anishinaabe saw a potential, or the Peguis saw a potential to build with the Hudson Bay Company. And for one reason or another, Peguis felt that he had the jurisdiction to be able to provide land plots along the Red River, 2 miles on each side, to provide for the Selkirk settlers who had failed for the first 3 seasons living in Selkirk. In fact, the Selkirk settlers showed up in October. Like, who shows up in Manitoba in October to try to make a life? Like, you only have to like be an idiot, right? And so like they didn't actually survive. Peguis had to send them to Fort Pembina, or walk them to Fort Pembina, because they couldn't even feed themselves. And so finally, Peguis eventually watches this Selkirk settlement struggle. As a result, then builds this relationship with the Selkirk settlers in which they can live along the river, but he doesn't give the land in which ownership would think of it. He didn't give the land saying, can you imagine for just a moment, Peguis says to Selkirk, I never want to use the river again. I never want to wash again. I never want to eat fish again. Like that is a very non-native way to think about treaty. Peguis, of course, would still want to use the river. Of course, he would still use those lands, the precise lands of Nestawea, the exact spaces in which non-native peoples were going to live were exactly the lands that Peguis wanted himself. It was the most fertile, the most available, the most beneficial. Here's why I think Peguis put white people along the river. This is my personal theory. This is no official theory, but is that right now the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota were struggling over the bison in this area. And the bison have a crossing which is right about here. Actually, it's more like about here, actually. And the bison come across, and they have several crossings along the Red River. And then what happens is that they come and they disperse in this area right here. But like, if you're warring with a nation, what is more perfect than to put a wall of white people? Like the Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota people are not going to travel across this wall here. The Buffalo are going to, though. And suddenly the Anishinaabe have free reign towards thinking of, but anyways, so the Selkirk Treaty is built so that for the first time in history, non-native people have land in which they can live in Manitoba. This is the very first treaty. Now notice that Peguis signs using the clan system, using his dodems. So do the other Indigenous leaders, the 5 other Indigenous leaders who are in this territory. Why is that important? Because it's referring to the exact principles of tobacco and the creation story that I told you about in just a minute, which tells you that this agreement is under the parameters of Anishinaabe Indigenous law. That means we're going to share space. We're going to share the resources. We're not about ownership at all. It's much like the offering of tobacco. We're going to share gifts. We're going to renew it every year. And the most important thing of all is it is the animals, it is the birds, it is the fish who we must be thinking about. They're the most important elements of this treaty. That means when the city of Winnipeg dumps sewage into this river system, it's the violation of the first Treaty of Manitoba. When we let the water get so filled with algae, the original name of Winnipeg, which is referring to the lake, that's a violation of our treaty, which is our violation with our fish relatives. And here's the most important thing of all about the Selkirk Treaty. The clan system is pretty important. And, you know, the people often will say to me, well, you know, Indigenous peoples, because they sign treaties with British or French peoples, they therefore recognize the king's jurisdiction. Well, if that's true, that means that the British, the Scottish, Selkirk, recognized Indigenous law legally in this agreement, whether he agreed with whether he understood it or not. I frankly don't care if Europeans understood Indigenous law or not. They signed the agreement. Therefore, Indigenous law is valid. We should stop having to go to the Supreme Court every 20 minutes to argue who we fundamentally are. Canada's already recognized our laws. And therefore, it's not the job of Canada to understand our laws. It's our job to explain the laws to Canada and then just act therefore. Now, there's the most important part of the Selkirk Treaty is that Peguis said to Selkirk, you must bring each member of this treaty, meaning the 5 chiefs that represent the 5 signatory nations that come to this treaty, 100 pounds of tobacco each. That's 500 pounds of tobacco. Now, I don't know if you know, but like, how hard is it to grow 1 ounce of tobacco? Hundreds of hours. And that tells you that Peguis was saying to Selkirk, you must earn this relationship. We are offering you this. We are offering you this space. We are offering you the care and the concern of us. And probably most important, that the animals have recognized our nationhood. On behalf of them, we also recognize that you are a part of this nation now too. You are part of this community, not nations. We are part of a nation together, a treaty together, a family, not friends, but family. And then, but it's your job to bring food to the feast. You must bring that 500 pounds of tobacco every year and demonstrate the commitment that we have to each other. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way things worked out. And I had a good video there, but I'm just gonna I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna. This video right here is a wonderful video that you can watch online. It's a conversation between I'll just show you here with Bill Shedd, a couple historians. You know, it's a really wonderful people speaking about the Selkirk Treaty. When Peguis said to Selkirk, "You must bring that tobacco," Selkirk offered that once, but he never came back. He never came back and offered those gifts of that tobacco. What happened is that Selkirk disappeared, went to Montreal, died soon after that. And for the Selkirk settlers, they imagined this territory as their own. And they, in the Royal Proclamation, used British law to make claims along the river to say Indigenous peoples could not have those territories and could not access the river any further. And what ended up happening was that the original site of St. Peter's was formed. And while the parishes began to claim all of those lands under the Selkirk Treaty, which, by the way, if you buy any home in Winnipeg, you have to buy it off the parishes, which is from the original sites of the Selkirk Treaty settlement. So, for example, I have a house in River Heights. It says the RM of this parish. And it's because of the Selkirk Treaty that you are still buying that land off that treaty. That is what created the Selkirk, or the St. Peter's Indian Settlement. Now, the St. Peter's Indian Settlement, if you drive down into Selkirk, you can see the St. Peter's Church. William Cochrane was the parish priest at that point. The particular territory that Peguis decided to settle on, that particular territory, was a land that, notice that it's in the same area that encompasses Niigaanwewidam, right? And then the second is, notice how that particular territory was created particularly to create an agricultural settlement, because Peguis knew that that was the way in which land was going to be it was going to be continuing, but he kept the mouth of the Lake Winnipeg, which was a crucial element of connective threads to Norway House, because Norway House was one of the places in which Selkirk was very deeply tied to. In fact, the name of Selkirk in Norway House is called the landing place. And so Selkirk is a very deep, or St. Peter's is a very close area to Norway House, which is where most of the settlers, and that's where my family comes from. My great-grandfather comes from Norway House. My great-grandmother comes from Manicotagan. People came and settled in Niigaanwewidam or St. Peter's, and they began to do things like convert or become farmers. Peguis becomes William King because he took the name of William Cochrane, the first name of William, the priest at the St. Peter's parish, and he also baptized himself. And he said to William Cochrane, he said, "What's the name of your leader? Or what's the role of your leader?" And they said, "Well, that's the king." He says, "Well, that shall be my name. My name shall be William King." And he said, "What's the name of the sons of the king?" They said, "Princes." And that will be the name of my sons from this point onwards. And that's where the name Prince comes from in Manitoba. So that's why there's so many princes in Peguis. Now, boom, let's zoom ahead 90 years. In 90 years, Selkirk has formed, the town of Selkirk has formed nearby, has become one of the trading hubs. Why are they become one of the trading hubs? Because one of the most important, richest agricultural farmlands is in and around Selkirk. But meanwhile, the St. Peter's Indian Settlement has become one of the most successful settlements in Western Canada. Most of the people there have baptized themselves, have become Christians. They are still also traditional people. There's a Medewan Lodge happening at that same place. There is a bit of a schism, though, because William Cochrane and all of his other ancestors in the St. Peter's Indian settlement didn't like traditional spirituality, didn't allow it in the community. But it's very notable to show that when you look at the cemetery at the St. Peter's Indian settlement, there's several burial spots just outside of the graveyard, which are William King's sons, or Chief Peguis' sons, who are the Midewiwin leaders in that territory. So it wasn't that Midewiwin disappeared, but it certainly, there was a schism in the community of what was the role of traditional spirituality. But most of the people at St. Peter's were Christians. They were also farmers. This is the St. Peter's Indian Church right here, and this is where there's a burial site of Peguis. But in 1907, the Government of Canada, the town of Selkirk, the province of Manitoba, hold an illegal vote because they see that first off, the St. Peter's settlement is way too successful. In fact, it's doing so successful, it's keeping the non-native farmers, like the ancestors of Selkirk, they are not doing as well because the agricultural products that are being produced at St. Peter's, far more successful. Second is that there's this schism between traditional and Christianity that's happening at that point. And so Craig Charbonneau-Fontaine did a really wonderful anthology which document the news articles that were written in and around this time that talks about the kind of petulant attitudes and the inappropriate behavior and the debauchery that takes place at St. Peter's. Really what they're talking about is traditional spirituality. That's what they're talking about. And they'll say things like, they'll say things like, don't go to St. Peter's or else you'll see some of the witchcraft and the superstitions and so on. And the third thing that's happening is the impact of colonization. So within the St. Peter's settlement, like most Indigenous communities at that point, there are impacts of residential schools happening. There's impact of land theft and land removals, violence and stereotypes and racism. And so you're beginning to see the beginning points of trauma that many of those things we can see evidence in our Indigenous communities today. And so there's also a number of things that Fontaine documents in his news articles is talking about alcoholism at St. Peter's. And so Selkirk used that to make an argument to the Government of Canada, the Government of Manitoba, to remove us off the land, and therefore we were forcibly removed in 1907 through an illegal and unjust vote and forced to move to what's now Peguis First Nation. And that's the history of the Treaty of Selkirk. The Treaty of Selkirk comes from all of those different things that have happened over that long period of time until 2007, where Peguis was offered $121 million in compensation for that forcible removal. The community then voted overwhelmingly for that compensation, and each one of us got a very small per diem, a per capita payout, $1,000, I believe, and $2,000 for elders. And then the rest of the money, which is around $80 to $90 million, is in a trust fund, which is intended for us to buy land at the former site of St. Peter's to begin to repossess our homeland. Now, some of us have always lived there. My family has always lived in St. Peter's. In fact, on this past couple days, about 3 days ago, I drove out to St. Peter's to go look at our former homestead, which is right across the river from the St. Peter's Indian Church, St. Peter's Indian Settlement, or the St. Peter's Church, which is where the settlement was. And my family moved into a small cabin right beside the St. Peter's Indian Hospital, which was where my great-grandmother worked. And so we were called squatters. We were harassed by RCMP until finally my family moved into the town of Selkirk in the 1950s. But we've always occupied that space. We are at the traditional site of what was originally Peguis First Nation. However, many of the families, approximately 80 of the families, were forcibly removed, and they now live in Peguis First Nation. And there were approximately 30 to 40 families that stayed in and around the St. Peter's site. And so that's why you get people within Selkirk who are Peguis First Nations members, also connected to Peguis First Nation genealogically. Many of us have very distant ties to, like Sinclairs that I don't even know, but we are somehow distantly related. But because of political outcomes, particularly in the 1990s, there was a movement in Peguis to not recognize those St. Peter's Indians who had been removed under Bill C-31, or being re-accepted under Bill C-31. And so because they were seen as voting for off-reserve interests. And so half of my family could not get membership at Peguis First Nation. So there are memberships all across Canada, or all across Manitoba, at different First Nations. But my family, probably because of my father's connections, was able to get our membership back at Peguis First Nation. And so that's where my daughter is listed. And So I hope that that was helpful. I hope that you understood a little bit about the Selkirk Treaty, a little bit about our removal as well. There's really some wonderful videos that that I didn't really have time for today, but you can catch those on YouTube. You can check it out. And if you, for some reason, tuned in late and you weren't able to see some of the beginning parts, there's a talk that I gave at the Manitoba Mennonite University and the Canadian Mennonite University, CMU. And it's on YouTube. You can check it out. And there's a talk that I gave about 4 years ago. Some of the stuff that I talked about today is in that talk as well. So with that, I say huge miigwech and thank you for your time. I'll hand it back to Sharissa over here.
Thank you, Niigaan. I know we only have 2 minutes left, but are you okay? Or sorry, are you okay if we open it up for questions? Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
I could talk about this all day, so I probably took a lot of time. Sorry.
That's okay. I could listen to it all day. I love that. I could say. I also wanted to say we have a few comments from Facebook. Jody says this has been very helpful for understanding some of the history with treaties. Quite an eye-opener as well. I look forward to learning more. Thank you, Niigaan. We have a former student saying it's your presentation has taken her back to being in your class. That's awesome. A lot of Kinanaskomitins, a lot of miigweches. I know some of our staff had questions. Noah, and I also want to open it up to our live viewers to ask questions. I'll pass it off to Noah because he always has tons of questions.
Well, miigwech, that was such an awesome talk. I'm just a little curious if there's anything you'd like to share about some of the changes you've seen in the types of conversations you get into related to this topic. Like, are you noticing, and this could be with students or, you know, with your own family, are you kind of noticing some changes in the...
So yeah, like this, thanks for reminding me of that, Noah. Like, I know I talked about this at the beginning and I sort of, because I wanted to wrap up, there are certain things that are happening in Selkirk that are remarkable. Like, for instance, Selkirk has had Métis people or First Nations people who had not known they were First Nations until Bill C-31 and were able to gain their status back because they were the ancestors of the removal of St. Peter's, entering into business leadership positions, city politics or formerly town politics. There are Indigenous peoples, like if you go to Selkirk, for example, I would say half the businesses in Selkirk are owned by Indigenous people, Métis or First Nations people. In the major mayor positions, we have a Métis mayor. Name me a town in Manitoba that has had a consistent Métis or First Nations mayor going back decades. You can't find that. And so that's interesting. There's a town, or in Selkirk, for example, there's a park named after my father. And of course, for the work that my dad's done with the TRC and so on. And of course, my dad grew up just north of Selkirk at the former St. Peter's settlement, then moved into town in the 1960s. But like name me a town in Manitoba where there's a park named after a First Nations person. What I'm trying to tell you is that there are different examples here and there. I'm working on with Niverville right now on a big display that they're doing in their town. But like, you haven't seen that for the decades that have been happening in Selkirk. And what that means is like when I was in school, all of the presidents that were in student council were Native kids. This is like a major mainstream. I was the president of my high school. The year after that, it was a guy named Chris Robson who
Oh, Niigaan is frozen. Yeah. We'll just give it a second. We have lots of thank yous coming in. So many thank yous. Let's see here.
Did I lose you there?
Okay, you're back. You're back
right.
on.
Anyway, all I'm trying to say is that I don't know where you caught me off there, but like there's things happening in Selkirk that are worth noting. I went out and gave a talk at Selkirk a few years ago to say You know, Selkirk did reconciliation back in the 70s when there was no such word. Like the word didn't exist. And what I mean is that like there are things that have happened in that place because of the St. Peter's Indian removal, and people that were fierce and resistant and refused to go away and lived on their homelands regardless of the police harassment, regardless of the racism and the stereotypes, regardless of the fact that today in 2021, there still isn't a monument to recognize the former site of St. Peter's. The fact that that racism is such a profound part of that town, of that community, but yet still Indigenous peoples did remarkable things anyways. And remarkable, dynamic, creative, innovative things that have continued our presence in that place my whole life. Like there's a reason why the Selkirk Friendship Center when I was growing up was the hub of the community. And it's because of the St. Peter's Indian settlement and all the things that have happened in that removal. So Noah, you asked like, what are the things that have been different? I can tell you there are more conversations happening about St. Peter's than ever before now.
Miigwech.
I can say. Okay, so we are out of time officially, but I do have one more quick question. What is something you want everyone to know about treaties?
Well, I think it's the things I spoke about before. Like treaty is about sharing space. It's not about owning space. So the way that treaty is often personified in Canadian law, it's about land purchases or determining my land is over here and your land's over here. And I would say many Indigenous peoples, because we've been forced into these ideas around law, Canadian law particularly, we sometimes buy into that idea. We think that treaty is about saying this is my land and that's your land. That's not what treaty was supposed to be about. Treaty was supposed to be about how do we share this space together? How do we co-govern? How do we make sure that our children will live together more, not less? Now, of course, the problem is that you've got the Royal Proclamation or Canadian law. Canada makes the Royal Proclamation law in 1867. So Canada almost can't speak that language. But that doesn't mean that we should give up our laws.
That way.